So, David, we'll have other conversations about sort of the political implications of the coronavirus. They are in some ways defined by what the realities of what the coronavirus will do. But they're also, they also center around, the anxiety. And one of the things that the coronavirus, it appears to be doing, is not just, well, I think, shining a light on the general incompetence of the Trump administration and their defunding of our ability to respond from a health perspective and from a logistical perspective. It is shining light on the relationship the United States has with the rest of the world in terms of relying on them for all sorts of products that we use in our daily life that we really have no awareness of where it comes from or what's involved with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the attacks on Trump from the left on the sort of incompetence and the various cuts to pandemic response programs need to be tempered a little bit, because for 40 years, we've had this bipartisan initiative to outsource our manufacturing base to not just other countries abroad, but largely to one country abroad, and that would be China, and to centralize the supply chain for just about everything in this one region of the world. And it's not just that it was China. It could have been any country in the world. When you centralize the supply and make have a situation where your product lines are all coming from one place, then any shock to the system in that one location is going to be incredibly magnified. And so this is not about just China per China. This is about the concentration of the outsourcing in general. And what it created is exactly what we're seeing. So, large sections of China have been shut down, put on quarantine. Workers don't want to go back to the factories because they fear catching the virus. And production has basically shut down in large parts of China. Wuhan is a big manufacturing region. It's almost like the Detroit of China, what Detroit was in the 1960s.
Right.
And when you do that, especially with the way in which logistics works these days, with just-in-time shipping and component parts made in one part of the world and moved to another manufacturing location and put into another part, it's not just the finished goods coming out of China, but those components, those intermediate goods that then don't get to a factory somewhere else in the world. And that factory needs to shut down or slow production. And so you can see how this just absolutely cascades all over the world, and it's going to lead to shortages. I mean, we're going to see it. This is baked in already. You can't just shut down production for a month and not expect consequences.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I should say that I've been I'm a little gadget lover, and on like a Kickstarter and Indiegogo, those type of things, you get these emails, and I look at the gadgets, and there's like a thing that will inflate your bike tires, and it's handheld, and they're doing the production in China, and then all of a sudden I get an email that, look, we were expecting delivery in January of 2020, but the factories have been shut down for 2 or 3 months. We don't know when they're getting back in, and so this is going to slow things down. Well, this is this little specialty product. It's not going to mean much to me, but everything that's happening to my little handheld, bike pump is also happening to products that we use every single day. And
that was policy. That wasn't just some unseen force and hand at the market that just dictated that the Chinese were better at making stuff than any other place on earth. This was concerted policy to allow multinationals to seek the lowest common denominator, the cheapest labor costs, and the places where the logistics was most built up, and move all of their production and all of their factories there. And there was a danger to that. Nobody sort of added in the hidden costs that we're seeing right now with supply shocks and how that will, rebound all over this country and the world. Right. We made a policy to stop producing in America, that we would be a service-oriented, consumer-oriented economy. And now we are at risk because of that fateful decision.
All right, and I want to dig into that in a moment. So what we have here is a situation where we have sort of the classic problem of having all your eggs in one basket. And then we have an additional problem that basket is it's unclear what happens in that basket because of the nature of the government that we're talking about, China. And there's a whole host of other complications that are a function, that are problematic about the basket. But the main problem is we put all the eggs in the basket. And I want to get to why we did this. Like, I understand why. Like, when you say this was a policy, I mean, clearly this was a decision by individual, corporations to say, like, where can we go to get the cheapest labor? What did the U.S. government do to A, discourage that, or B, encourage it?
Well, they absolutely encouraged it. I can tell you from personal experience, my father worked in the textile industry. And in 1978, 1979, he went to Washington, one and only time he lobbied. He went with a group of other textile manufacturers to talk to people in Washington about the loss of their industry. And they told him flat out, we are giving up this industry for the benefit of world peace. And what they meant was that this was a low-skill profession that they could move abroad and give hope and opportunity to some other country that then would not be engaged in civil unrest because its people would have at least some industry within it. So we willingly, the government willingly, allowed this to happen, allowed multinationals to move their operations abroad. Before, when my father did that in the 1970s, there were hundreds of sweater mills within the Philadelphia area where I grew up. Now there are 0. And that was a policy choice that the United States made to rid ourselves of the textile industry. And that was replicated on and on and on down the line. And it went into things that we should not give up for the basis of self-sufficiency and, in some cases, national security. And we're talking about weapon systems, and we're talking about the real danger with respect to coronavirus, which is all of the pharmaceuticals and medical supplies that are made in China and elsewhere.
You were walking us through the dilemma that we now face because of decisions that were made 40 years ago by the U.S. government in some way to encourage or not to discourage the outsourcing of our manufacturing capacity for a whole host of industries, including, you said in your dad's case, the textile business, but also dealing with drugs and vaccinations and whatnot. And we put all our eggs in one basket. That basket also happened to be not only be a rival, but one which was fairly obscure and less than opaque, and one which we are now relying upon for some of our basic goods. You've also told us that it's already happening. we haven't felt the shortages, but the shortages are coming because it's like, the rat, as it were, has not made its way through the snake, but it is already in the mouth. It's already being digested. We are at the tail, and we don't realize it's coming yet. And that is, of course, these shortages. So, all right. First off, answer that question I asked at the end of the last segment. How sincere were the government officials who told your dad when he went there and to save the textile business outside of Philadelphia that they were doing this to help these other countries? And what could the government have done to stop corporations for going to where the lowest labor costs were?
I mean, I don't think they were sincere at all, but ultimately that doesn't matter. They made the policy choice. And they could have obviously made a different choice. I mean, globalization was not preordained. It was not a necessary precondition. I mean, the sort of neoliberal ideology suggests that it is, but the Ricardian comparative advantage is not a suicide pact. We didn't have to do this. We knew that there were going to be huge consequences for this on our domestic manufacturing base, on large segments of the country, of millions of people's lives, all the jobs that we ended up losing from industry, and what that did to the fabric of these communities. We knew all that was going to be troublesome, and we didn't create nearly enough assistance or trade adjustment assistance, things like that, to compensate for that. We just went and did it, and it had terrible consequences on its own. I mean, that thing is something we should say. Like, the loss of millions of jobs in America from manufacturing is a problem in and of itself. Now, the lengthening and concentration of the supply chain was a separate problem that introduced risk into the system. But this would have been bad even if we outsourced to 30 countries, right? This would have been a problematic for the winners and losers and a great many losers that it created. But what could have been done differently? I mean, there are tons of I have heard since 2004 this whole concept that we're going to stop incentivizing outsourcing. Every Democratic campaign since at least then has said, we're going to stop incentivizing outsourcing. Well, we've obviously haven't stopped, since they keep running the same ad that says we're going to stop it. And, this has been government policy for roughly 40 years now. So there were definitely ways where we could have discouraged this stampede out of this country from the standpoint of manufacturing, but we chose not to.
We only have about 5 minutes left now. I want to get to the piece that you wrote in terms of sure. that touches on the shortage of drugs that we're going to have. Drugs, and we don't really know exactly which drugs we won't have and when, do we, at this point?
Well, I mean, it goes beyond drugs, first of all. I mean, the largest segment of surgical masks, which are, a way to stop respiratory diseases like this from spreading, come out of China. We know that penicillin and antibiotics and ibuprofen, all of these basic generic drugs, all come out of China. And more to the point, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that are used to manufacture prescription drugs all over the world, about 80% of those come from China and India. And even that which comes from India gets part of its component parts from China. So we are very reliant as a world on China for these medications. And the question is why? And the answer has a lot to do with the way that these generic drugs are contracted and sold, particularly to hospitals. So there are these bulk buying groups known as group purchasing organizations, or GPOs, that purchase on behalf of hospital chains and many hospital chains sort of agglomerated together. And the idea is intuitive, right? I mean, you have to buy these various supplies or various drugs, and you'd probably get a better price if you buy 1,000 of them than if you buy one at a time. So that's the idea behind it. However, the way that market is structured is it incentivizes, one, higher costs for these drugs and these supplies, and two, it creates a system where the group purchasing organizations are paid by the suppliers, and they have to give up large portions of their percentage margin to the suppliers in order to get the market share. We only have four major buying groups, four major GPOs across the country that service all of the hospitals, the $300 billion in purchasing. And so if you get one of those contracts, you're in business. And if you don't, you can't stay in business. And so that has concentrated and harmed the proliferation of a generic drug industry. And then you have to pay so much to buy that access that you have to, reduce those costs somewhere else down the chain. So it's almost impossible to create prescription drugs in the United States, given the labor and environmental standards that we have, because there's literally no money in it. So this incentivized the move of this entire industry into the hands of places like China.
Interesting. And so we sort of saw, I guess, an analogous. We have a geographic problem now in terms of the concentration and what we rely on, and it sort of came out of a concentration of just sort of like a corporate concentration that led to this geographic concentration, and we have the same problem twice over, as it were.
Right. It was kind of a messed up market structure that incentivized these middlemen to skim large amounts of money out of the top of the transaction, and made it so that the only way to survive as a generic drug maker is to move abroad, number one. And number two, it locked the hospitals and the providers into buying from these groups. Most of these GPO contracts say you not only are buying this year from this generic drug manufacturer, you have to keep buying from them next year or the year after or the year after. You're going to get these huge penalties. And so when there's a supply shock from that one manufacturer, the hospitals have nowhere else to go. And the dirty secret here, and what coronavirus is actually going to mask, is that there have been persistent drug shortages in the generic industry, these very old line, sterile injectables, just normal drugs that are used in hospitals. These have been persistent for about a decade. Wow. There are currently 145 drugs in shortage. And it's because of this GPO system. And, in a way, that's going to get bailed out by the coronavirus, because everyone's going to think, oh, well, there was this problem in China, and that's the reason why we have all these drug shortages. No, we've had them. We've been enduring them for a long period of time, and it's because this market is completely broken.
Would seem like something that you would want to see some congressional hearings about. Maybe we will. David Dayen, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.